call this Vietnam Part 3. Vietnam Part 3. Where we left off, we were just talking about the Vietnamization of the war in Vietnam. We talked about troops in Laos. We talked about extending that. We talked about the secret Pentagon papers that were released that showed that we have actually sent more bombs to North Vietnam than we did in all of Europe. So public support is basically gone at this point, okay? It is important to note that people were supporting the troops. There was a minority of people that bashed some of the troops, but America, for the most part, nothing like we see today, but not all America was against this war, okay? So it is important to note that. I know that media and things have said differently, but there was support for the war. It's waning, okay? It's been a long war. We've had over 50,000 men killed, and there's really no end in sight. So people are pretty much done with this. And all this kind of goes into it as well. As we move on, okay, we have that huge Easter communist offensive, and we do stop it. We continue to bomb North Vietnam, called Operation Linebacker. But it's apparent that a lot of the problems are coming within South Vietnam. Most of the fighting is occurring within South Vietnam with the Viet Cong. And we have tried to take the battle to them in Cambodia and Laos, but back home we're getting a lot of flack for that as well. So we're going to start turning this over. In January, it should say January 27th, not 17th, January 27th, 1973, Nixon announces a ceasefire. It was signed in Paris by the U.S., North and South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. And basically, it came up with these provisions. Number one, the U.S. will withdraw all forces from South Vietnam within the next 60 days. Okay? All forces will be withdrawn from South Vietnam. Number two, all POWs will be released. All POWs will be released. Number three, all parties would end military operations in Laos and Cambodia. All parties. So not just us. Number four, the 17th parallel will still be used to divide Vietnam. So basically this ends U.S. military involvement, but the war will continue between the North and South Vietnam for 2 more years. Okay, what happens is, basically, as soon as we pull our troops out, North Vietnam attacks. Okay, so when we leave, everything is status quo. But we also leave knowing that this is probably going to happen. And literally, almost the second that we get our last troops out, the North will invade. Okay, the North steadily takes ground from the South and moves toward the capital of Saigon, which is now under North Vietnamese control. Saigon would fall at the end of April of 1975. American helicopters would carry more than 1,000 Americans and 6,000 Vietnamese to aircraft carriers offshore. The country of Vietnam was now one country. They were reunited, but they are now under a communist government. Okay? And here are some pictures of this. This is one of the most famous pictures. That's a ladder. They're not floating in the air. But these are all the people waiting this is the U.S. Embassy trying to get people out. Very famous picture. We also have what are called the boat people. People were trying to escape the communists in Vietnam, and they would do it by getting on anything that floated and try to get out to some American ships. And thousands would die in their attempt to do this. So, that's what's going on in Vietnam in 1975 at this point. Okay. Now the results of this For the Americans, okay, there's over 58,000 names on the Vietnam Memorial, which is in Washington, D.C. There's a picture of it. We had 1,200 MIA, which is missing in action. Okay, they're basically, a lot of them were POWs that we were convinced are POWs, and this has gone on for years after the war. Especially like when I was growing up, there were rumors that there were still POWs in Vietnam, and even some action was supposedly taken by the Americans to try to find them, and unfortunately that didn't happen. Names are still added. Okay, since 1997, 88 names have been added. 6 were just added in 2010 to the wall. Some of them could be, remains have been found or things like that. A lot of them you can actually be added if your wounds had caused your death from that. There were 2.7 million men and women that served in the war zone. Over 58,000 died. 300,000 were wounded at a cost of over $150 billion. Okay, very expensive war, especially costly in lives. And when we pulled out, it was basically status quo. And as soon as we left, it was, we knew that they were going to take over. Now, as far as numbers go, okay, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong lost over 1 million people, 1 million dead for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. So militarily, it just, the war did not go very well for the NVA and the Viet Cong. But in the eyes of public opinion, they used to call this the living room war, because it was basically broadcast live. And the American public seeing the body bags and seeing the violence and things like that. We can go back to this picture here. This is one of the most famous pictures from Vietnam era. Let me find it here. Obviously, this is from the, oops, too far, sorry. The Tet Offensive. Where to go? Getting there, sorry. Anyway, this picture was very famous after the Tet Offensive, where a man was executed in the street. Okay, this is not an American soldier. This is a South Vietnamese soldier. And he basically executes this man right there on the street. And it looks, of course, the papers kind of blow it up, but the real story behind this is that this man was in charge of a death squad who went after South Vietnamese policeman's family and killed the family. And so, right or wrong, this guy executes this man on the street. Okay, but he looks like he's a civilian. That's not the total story. Now, this is a South Vietnamese police officer doing this. Obviously, in our country, we prefer a trial. But this was shown and put all over the newspaper as well. Okay, as long with the My Lai massacre. So this war, if you ask a lot of vets, and I told you guys my dad was a vet as well. If you ask a lot of vets, they'll say that the war was lost by the media and not by the troops. Okay, in fact, was the war lost at all? When we left, things were status quo. So, that's your own personal opinion. Okay, that is the Vietnam War. We'll discuss some more at a later time. Stay classy, Vandalia.